Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for coming to our session today. Will I fit in abroad? Social identities and things to consider. This presentation is brought to you by UCEAP and ISA by Worldstrides.
Hello, everyone.
And so I'm joined by my good friend, Ines DeRomana, who's going to introduce herself, as well as share with all of us what brings her to the conversation today.
Hello, everyone, and thank you, Malaika, very much. I think this is a very important conversation for all of us, particularly for students who start considering study abroad. In my case, through the years, I have gained a lot of different identities. And some of them happened when I arrived in the United States. As a person of European ancestry, coming from a Latin American country, I had assumed I was white. When I arrived in the United States, I was surprised to find out I was regarded colored and I was seen as a Latina. Then during my stay here in the United States, that has become my country, I traveled to Spain. And I had assumed, because I am fluent in Spanish, that I would blend with the local community. However, some of the words that I used immediately identified me as someone coming from Latin America, particularly the use of diminutives. And it was a source of comments and funny statements about my use or pervasive use of diminutives.
Well, thank you so much for that. Those wonderful stories, Ines. And what you've shared resonates strongly with me personally as well. So again, friends, my name is Malaika Serrano, and I'm the Vice President for Diversity and Inclusion with ISA by Worldstrides. For myself, so I self-identify as being a U.S. American who's been here for many, many generations. But interestingly enough, growing up, I often encountered microaggressions from my peers asking, "Where are you from, Malaika?" "No, where are you really from?" And so we would do our family ancestry, and it turns out that oftentimes my ancestors had been in the United States much longer than theirs had been. So kind of interesting on that. Now, let's look at identity in another context. You'd mentioned, studying in Spain and how you were perceived there. I can also recall when I went to South Africa, so I identify as being African American or Black, but in a South African context, as soon as I landed in Johannesburg, boom, suddenly my racial category changed. I became colored in South Africa in that context because of my mixed ancestry. And so for our students who are listening today, we hope that our personal shares and stories are helpful in getting you all to begin to think about how your identities may present in both a US or local context as well as abroad. So that actually leads us to our next slide here. So this big colorful wheel that we have up on the screen is the social identity wheel. And I'd like to focus our attention to the center of the wheel because the identities that are presented here, age, sexual orientation, race, gender, etc., are typically identities that are very, very salient, at the core of our identity of who we believe, who we are. And we learn about those identities and where we fit, what aspects of the wheel belong to us from our earliest interactions with family and friends and churches and synagogues and schools. And within the wheel, you see there are both identities that are visible and identities that are invisible or non-apparent. We also have intersecting identities. And so some of us may identify, say, perhaps as being Latinx and members of the LGBTQ+ community and perhaps religion might be, Catholic. So quite a number of different intersecting identities here. And what's important again is to begin to unpack and identify how our identities present both in US contexts as well as the location where we are planning on going abroad. So Ines, I'm wondering if you could walk us through some health, safety, and security considerations.
Thank you, Malaika. Yes, I think it is an important slide that our students need to pay attention to as they start preparing for their study abroad experience. The study abroad experience and the risk factors intersect in many, many countries around the world, including in the United States. There are many factors, risk factors here as well. What is important here is that we are going to collaborate in this preparation with you. You need to engage your UC campus advisor to discuss identity considerations as part of your study abroad journey. And some of those considerations include the consideration of the risk factors on the slide. How do you identify in the United States? How might that change abroad, like we discussed with our personal stories? Which aspects of your identity are more meaningful to you? Though many countries and cities around the world have made it illegal, street harassment may have a detrimental impact on your perceived safety in public. We don't think about those things often here in the United States, but it does happen in the United States. Every country in the world has some form of street harassment. There may be little difference between the pervasiveness of harassment women and individuals of the LGBT community experience. The motivation is different. Men harassing women are often driven by their society-driven entitlement, while homophobia is a driving force behind the harassment directed at LGBT individuals. Which local laws affect you, how you express your identity in your host country? Are there laws in place making it unsafe to be open about sexual identity? Some countries are more permissive than others. Will certain identities grant power and privilege abroad, while others do not? In some countries, there is skin tone bias related to and distinct from discrimination on the basis of race. Preferential treatment of lighter skin tones over darker occurs within and between racial and ethnic groups. In countries with ethnic or racial conflicts, your appearance may identify you with one group or another.
Thank you for that, Ines. Really, really important and powerful pieces that you're sharing here. And so when we think about how our identities may be perceived abroad and how that context is everything, one of the things that Ines and I wanted to turn attention to is looking at microaggressions and implicit bias. So implicit bias is also referred to as unconscious bias, which are preferences that one has either for or against someone or something based around stereotypes. And these microaggressions are the enactment of those. Sometimes microaggressions are conscious, but oftentimes they are unconscious. And so what we have up on our screen are ways in which microaggressions can present in a classroom and in a program context. And so one of the microaggressions that we lifted up a little bit earlier as we were discussing our own personal stories is that one around assuming that you are from somewhere else. And this is typically something that a lot of our students encounter when they go abroad, because in a new context, they quote unquote do not appear to be American, unquote, as Ines had lifted up actually in her story. So the question then becomes, if you encounter a microaggression or if you are the recipient of a microaggression, how do you respond? And oftentimes when we think about microaggressions, the initial piece of that hurts, but then the agony of what do I do next can be just as deep, just as powerful. And so I'd like to turn to this great advice that was lifted up from several university professors in a recent Harvard Business Review article. And they have outlined 3 different ways in which one can respond. The first is to let it go. This is often a common response, not to address an offensive comment. Now, one of the negative side effects of that is that the silence can be an emotional tax, but that is one response. A second response would be to respond immediately. Now, this will have an immediate impact. However, the approach can be tricky. The perpetrator could potentially become defensive, therefore leaving the recipient of that microaggression feeling like a target. And the third, perhaps tempered response, is to address the perpetrator later, privately, and explain why that microaggression was offensive. Now, one of the ways in which one can address someone would be to say, "Oh, what did you mean by that?" Or, "Oh, tell me more." And what that does is it places the onus back on the individual who committed that microaggression to then stop and reflect and explain what was it that they meant by that. So hopefully that's a tool that will be helpful for you all. So next, we're going to take a look at a case study. Ines, could you walk us through?
Yes, thank you, Malaika. This is a case that happened many years ago in the Netherlands. Our students were studying at a host university, and some students within the UC student cohort wanted to hold a Black Pete party during their traditional St. Nicholas celebrations. St. Nicholas is portrayed in the Netherlands as an older white man who arrives by ship and rides a white horse through the streets in the Netherlands. Hundreds of adults and children dress up as his helper, Black Pete, wearing blackface, painted large red lips, and black curly wigs, and some with large golden earrings, a performance that happens every single year during the Christmas holiday. It has become recently a chronic national controversy. It is an example of a tradition that requires a lot of cultural translation. Many people in the Netherlands agree that this is an obsolete tradition that needs radical revision. Changes take time. In the Netherlands, like in many other European countries, there is regular political debate on social cohesion. Diversity and commonality are central to this debate. So the student in this particular case was extremely upset by fellow students holding such a party without any regard to the student's background. The UCEAP expectation of its students is that UC students act as allies for fellow UC students. So it was extremely surprising to us that this was happening. UCEAP discussed the issue with local partners, and they agreed to add to all the lectures on tolerance, diversity, and inclusion this celebration. So it is important for all of us, as Malaika correctly talked about microaggressions and implicit bias, is to consider them as you prepare to go abroad.
Thank you so much, Ines, for sharing that really powerful case study. And one of the central pieces that really resonates strongly for me are one, understanding the cultural context around the Black Pete, this particular piece, but then also two, looking at contemporary movements, that this actually is not something that folks in the Netherlands are going to be standing behind. And so it's interesting to sort of see this interplay here But then the other piece that I really appreciated about your sharing this case study is the expectations that we have of our students, of our community. So fostering community of inclusion and belonging. And so for me, to that end, I'd like to just share just a couple of words around active allyship.
Mm-hmm.
And so, allyship is really speaking up, when it's uncomfortable, difficult, or inconvenient. And so even if one is not coming from a historically minoritized community or is a recipient of that microaggression, or they still have an opportunity and, in my view, an obligation to speak up and to speak out for injustice. Taking ownership of one's education. So that's another piece, the continuing thread that we're finding, throughout our conversation today. As well as, recognizing that perhaps a conversation, the central part of it may or may not be around them, but to understand what role their community may have played in that offensive act. So in closing, Ines, I'm wondering if there are a few nuggets that you'd like to share with our students as they begin their education abroad journeys.
Yes, I think it is important that we all understand that we're in this together. It is also important that you as a student may need to make some temporary yet fundamental compromises on how you present yourself, and will need to develop techniques and personal strategies to manage situations. I think that the words of wisdom that Malaika has shared with us about allyship are something that you need to take at heart when you are in another country, and start practicing such allyship before departure.
Love it. Thank you so much, Ines, and thank all of you for taking the time to join us today. We appreciate it, and best wishes with your education abroad experience.
Thank you. Thank you, Malaika. Great talking to you today.